The empty plate. David Carter had grown used to the sound of clattering dishes, the low hum of conversation, and the faint hiss of the fryer that seemed to never rest. For him, this little restaurant tucked away at the corner of Maple and 3rd Avenue wasn't just a workplace. It was his battlefield and his refuge all at once. Every night after his shift, when the neon sign flickered against the rain-washed streets, David carried home just enough tip money to keep the lights on and the cupboards half-stocked. He was only 25, yet his shoulders already bore the weight of decades of responsibility. With his father gone and his mother's health fragile, he lived in the kind of reality where even a cup of coffee had to be calculated. Every coin stretched until it screamed. Still, he carried himself with quiet dignity, never letting the hardships show more than a faint line across his brow or a tired exhale when the night ran long. For 3 days, David had done something unusual. He had skipped every small indulgence, no bottled soda from the corner store, no cheap candy bar between shifts, no bus fare when he could walk the extra 20 minutes through biting autumn wind. He pinched each penny carefully, not because he was saving for rent or for a bill, but because he wanted to give himself something he rarely permitted, a small taste of luxury. A proper meal, not scraps at the end of a shift. A hot burger with crisp fries and maybe, just maybe, a slice of apple pie. It wasn't extravagance in the eyes of the world, but for David, it was a dream he clung to with the hunger of someone who had long forgotten what it felt like to treat himself without guilt. The diner itself was a place both warm and worn, its booths carrying the faint smell of leather polish mixed with fried onions. Tourists never wandered in here. The regulars were working people, mechanics, taxi drivers, the odd teacher grading papers late at night. The owner, Mr. Harris, was a man of strict rules and stricter budgets. His philosophy was simple: no free meals, no bending policies, because one act of generosity could set the precedent that would sink a place already surviving on thin margins. David respected him, though sometimes the rules felt like iron chains clamped across his heart. That evening, rain tapped against the glass in steady rhythm, like impatient fingers drumming a tabletop. The clock above the counter showed nearly 8. David had survived another long shift, and at last the moment came. He slipped into the back to wash his hands, then carefully placed an order for his long-awaited meal. He planned to sit down like any other customer for once, to savor the feeling of choosing food for pleasure, not necessity. He could almost imagine the taste already: the crunch of golden fries, the warmth of the burger, the sweetness of pie. But fate has a strange way of knocking on the door just when one believes they've earned a moment of rest. As David carried the tray out from the kitchen, he caught sight of something that made his steps falter. At the far corner booth, usually reserved for birthday gatherings or nervous first dates, sat an elderly couple. They were out of place among the tired workers and young families. The woman, dressed in what must have once been a fine leather coat, now damp and wrinkled from the downpour outside, clutched her hands tightly in her lap. The man beside her, tall but stooped, wore a suit so thoroughly soaked it clung to him like newspaper paste. On their table rested only 2 cups of coffee, gone cold long ago. David watched as the shift supervisor, Maria, approached with the bill. Her tone was gentle but firm, the kind of voice that tried to soften a blow but could not erase its sting. The couple searched their pockets in growing panic, glancing at one another with embarrassment that cut deeper than hunger. The man's hand brushed an empty wallet. The woman whispered something, her eyes darting toward the window where rain pounded harder, blurring the parking lot into a shifting mirror of neon lights. From the pass window in the kitchen, Mr. Harris watched, shaking his head. "Rules are rules," he muttered, loud enough for the staff to hear. The diner had survived on that mantra, yet tonight, watching the frail couple, David felt the weight of those words as if they were stones pressing against his chest. He shifted his gaze to the tray in his own hands. The burger was steaming, the fries perfectly golden, the slice of pie gleaming with sugar glaze. 3 days of small sacrifices sat on that tray, waiting to be his. But as the old man rose and placed a trembling hand on the door handle, and the woman cast a wistful glance back at the glow of the diner, her shoulders curling like a leaf too fragile to withstand the storm, David's grip on the tray tightened. He could feel time pressing down on him, each clink of forks, each call for extra sauce echoing like a ticking clock counting down to a decision. In that suspended moment, David remembered his mother's words. She used to tell him, "Being poor doesn't mean you have no dignity. True wealth is the ability to give even when it hurts." Those words had been like an anchor through the hardest years, and now they rose up unbidden, carrying him forward. He set the tray gently in front of the couple, his voice steady though his chest pounded. "This one's on me," he said softly, almost as though he were speaking to himself as much as to them. Then turning to Maria, he added, "Could you call a tow for their car? And I'll need to use the landline to reach the garage." The man lifted his head, blue eyes locking onto David's with a clarity that startled him. Gratitude shone there, yes, but something else too, something measured like the gaze of someone making careful notes. "Your name?" he asked, his voice crisp despite the circumstances. David hesitated a fraction, then replied, "David Carter." The man pulled a napkin toward him, drew a pen from his inside pocket and wrote the name slowly, deliberately, folding the napkin and slipping it into his jacket as if filing away an important record. The woman, meanwhile, clutched a slim leather folio, a golden emblem glinting faintly at its corner. David noticed it but thought little of it in the moment. Around them, life in the diner continued as if nothing unusual had happened. But for David, something had shifted. He sat with the couple briefly, offering them small conversation to make their presence feel ordinary. He spoke of the adult learning center where he sometimes studied, of his dream of building a training hub in the abandoned mall lot nearby, a place where people could find skills, dignity, and opportunity. The man nodded slightly with each phrase, his habit betraying the mind of someone who cataloged information carefully. Minutes later, the tow driver arrived, and the couple left with quiet dignity restored. Yet when the man straightened his collar before stepping into the rain, his posture transformed. The earlier frailty fell away, replaced by a commanding authority that unsettled David. For a heartbeat, he felt as though he had been standing before someone far greater than he appeared. But the moment passed, and the couple disappeared into the storm. David returned to his table. His burger was gone, but in its place Mr. Harris himself set down a fresh tray. "Not charity," the owner said firmly, locking eyes with him. "Respect." David smiled faintly, but unease lingered beneath the warmth of the food. Something about the couple's presence clung to him, like a shadow that refused to be shaken off. He did not know that this act, the simple giving of a meal, had set in motion events far beyond the walls of the diner. For David, the night ended with him walking home in the rain, bus fare still in his pocket, his shoes soaked through, yet his heart strangely light. He carried with him the memory of the woman's eyes, the man's deliberate writing of his name, and his mother's words echoing again, "Kindness given freely is never wasted." And so, the stage was quietly set. He believed he had simply traded a hot meal for the dignity of two strangers, but in truth, he had taken the first step toward a story that would alter his life forever. The silent test. The following morning came slowly, dragging pale light through curtains still damp with yesterday's storm. David Carter stirred awake in his modest apartment, the sound of his mother's gentle breathing from the next room a constant reminder of why he pushed himself day after day. The night before lingered heavily in his mind, the couple, the napkin with his name, the strange authority hidden beneath their frailty. He replayed the scene over and over, wondering why a man who looked broken down by rain could suddenly stand as though he had commanded entire rooms of power before. Yet when he looked around his small kitchen and the cracked linoleum underfoot, the thought felt foolish, almost like a dream. Powerful people did not wander into small diners late at night pretending to be ordinary. Life had taught David that the divide between their world and his was wider than oceans and just as merciless. Still, something gnawed at him. His shift wasn't due until evening, so he brewed a thin pot of coffee and sat by the window with a second-hand notebook he used for his ideas. For months he had filled its pages with sketches of programs he wished to build, a small clinic for the uninsured, a computer training center for young people looking to escape dead-end jobs, even a community kitchen where no one would be turned away for lack of cash. These dreams were far larger than his means, but writing them down gave him hope, as if the act itself could draw them closer to reality. Last night he had mentioned them to the couple in passing, almost by accident. Now he wondered why he had opened his heart to strangers. Maybe it was the way the woman's eyes had softened when he spoke, or the way the man seemed to listen without interruption, as though cataloging every word. By late afternoon, David was back at the diner. The storm had cleared, leaving the air sharp and clean. Customers trickled in, the usual truckers, teachers, and families with restless children. But tonight, something in the air felt slightly different. David noticed two men in dark suits sitting quietly near the entrance, their faces blank, their posture too rigid for casual diners. They ordered nothing but water and watched the room with eyes that never rested. Maria leaned close to David while refilling a coffee pot, whispering that she had never seen them before. David brushed it off, though unease prickled at the back of his mind. As he worked through the evening, small oddities continued. A man in a polished sedan idled outside longer than necessary. A phone call came in asking if David was on shift, though the voice on the other end hung up before Maria could respond. When a group of mechanics entered loudly, the suited men at the front shifted their attention not to the new customers, but back to David, as though making sure their subject had not slipped away. At one point, while clearing plates, David overheard Maria speaking with Pete, the tow driver who had helped the elderly couple the night before. Pete was shaking his head, lowering his voice. "That car wasn't broken, Maria," he said. "Engine was fine. Battery hadn't drained. Someone had pulled the cable loose on purpose, like staging a scene. And that wallet they claimed to lose, trust me, there was no way that man didn't have money. I saw the bills when he paid me. Thick stack." David's hand tightened around the plates he was carrying, though he kept his face calm. Pieces of the puzzle began to shift into place in his mind, though the picture remained blurred. If it had been staged, then why? What kind of people pretended to be helpless only to reveal they weren't? And why write his name on a napkin with such deliberate care? The thought of being tested gnawed at him, though it seemed absurd. He was just a waiter, barely keeping his head above water. Who would waste time testing someone like him? Later that night, as the diner slowed and customers dwindled, Mr. Harris approached him. "You did something yesterday that went against the rules," he said bluntly, though his tone lacked the sharpness it usually carried when addressing infractions. "But I'll say this once, I saw the way you handled it. No fuss, no begging for praise, no hesitation. That's rare. Most people would have held on to their meal and looked away. You didn't." He paused, his eyes narrowing slightly. "But be careful, David. Sometimes kindness brings good things, but sometimes it draws attention you don't want." Those words lingered with David even after the diner closed and the neon lights flickered out. The walk home felt longer than usual, every echo of his footsteps magnified in the stillness. When he reached his building, he noticed a black sedan parked across the street. Its headlights were off, yet he could sense eyes behind the glass. He slowed, heart pounding, then forced himself to keep walking, refusing to give them the satisfaction of seeing his fear. Inside, his mother was waiting, awake despite the late hour. Her health had been declining, but her spirit remained fierce. She listened as David reluctantly told her about the couple, the napkin, and the strange occurrences that followed. Her thin hand closed over his, her grip surprisingly strong. "Sometimes angels disguise themselves, David," she said softly. "Sometimes they come to test if you'll still give when no one is watching, when no reward is promised. If it was a test, you passed it. Don't fear the unknown. Fear only losing your kindness." Her words gave him comfort, but sleep did not come easily. Each time he closed his eyes, he saw the man's piercing blue gaze, the deliberate motion of writing his name. He heard Pete's warning about the staged car, felt the silent scrutiny of the suited men in the diner. He drifted into uneasy dreams filled with shadowed figures and questions that refused to be answered. The next morning, as David prepared to leave for another shift, there was a knock at the door. It was firm, measured, not the casual rap of a neighbor, but the deliberate knock of someone who expected to be answered. David froze, his heart racing. No one ever visited unannounced. His mother peered from the hallway, worry etched into her features. Slowly, David approached the door, every step heavy with the weight of uncertainty. When he opened it, the world seemed to shift again. Standing before him was a man in a tailored black suit, polished shoes gleaming despite the damp pavement. His expression was calm, unreadable, but his eyes carried the same sharp authority David had glimpsed in the diner. Behind him, parked neatly at the curb, was the same black sedan David had seen the night before. "David Carter?" the man asked, his voice low yet commanding. David nodded slowly, gripping the doorframe to steady himself. "My employer would like to speak with you," the man continued. "It's about what happened at the diner." And with those words, the pieces of David's unease clicked into place, though the picture they formed was more frightening than he had dared imagine. The knock at the door. David stood frozen at the doorway, his hand still gripping the frame as if letting go would mean surrendering himself entirely to whatever new chapter was pressing forward from the street outside. The suited man did not move beyond the threshold, but the silence between them pressed heavy, carrying more weight than words could. Behind the man, the black sedan idled patiently, its engine a low hum that seemed to reverberate through the damp morning air. David could sense that this was not an invitation he could decline, and yet every instinct in him wanted to retreat, to close the door and pretend the knock had never come. From the hallway, his mother's faint cough echoed, and when he turned slightly, he saw her watching him with sharp, searching eyes. She had always been able to read him better than anyone, even when he tried to shield her from worry. She gave a small nod, the kind that carried both trust and command. "Go," she whispered, her voice raspy but resolute. "If they've come this far, they won't stop at the door. Better you face it standing tall." Her words steadied him in a way nothing else could, for she had lived her whole life teaching him that dignity meant meeting the unknown without bowing his head. Taking a deep breath, David stepped outside, pulling the door closed behind him. The suited man gestured toward the sedan without flourish, his movements precise, professional, as though orchestrated 1,000 times before. David hesitated for a heartbeat, his mind racing with questions, but then the rear door of the sedan opened from within. There, seated in the plush interior, was the elderly man from the diner, though the frailty David remembered had vanished. His suit was pressed, his posture commanding, and his eyes carried that unmistakable authority that had unsettled David the night before. The woman was beside him, her coat no longer wrinkled by rain, her hair carefully set, her presence radiating the quiet composure of someone long accustomed to boardrooms and banquets, not damp booths in a modest diner. "Mr. Carter," the man said, his voice clear and strong now, stripped of any trace of the helplessness he had worn the previous evening. "Please join us. We have matters to discuss." David slid into the car, the leather seat sinking beneath him with a softness that contrasted so starkly with the cracked vinyl of diner booths that it felt almost surreal. The door closed with a muffled click, sealing him into a world utterly foreign to his own. As the sedan pulled away from the curb, he glanced back at his building, at the window where he knew his mother stood watching. He lifted a hand slightly, a small gesture of reassurance, though his own heart trembled with uncertainty. The ride was quiet for several minutes, the city streets rolling past in a blur. David sat stiffly, acutely aware of the man and woman across from him. At last the man spoke, his words deliberate, carrying the weight of someone unaccustomed to wasting breath. "My name is Samuel Whitford. This is my wife, Eleanor. You may not know us, but our foundation has worked quietly in communities across this country for decades. What happened last night at the diner was not chance, Mr. Carter. It was a test." The words landed like a stone in David's chest. He felt his throat tighten, his mind scrambling to process. "A test?" he managed, his voice low, cautious. Whitford nodded, his eyes never leaving David's. "We study people, Mr. Carter, not through resumes or rehearsed interviews, but through moments when their true character reveals itself. We wanted to know how you would act when faced with a choice that cost you personally, but meant dignity for others. You sacrificed your own meal, something you had saved for days, not for recognition, not because anyone told you to, but because you could not watch another human being walk away in shame. That told us more than any document could." Eleanor leaned forward slightly, her voice softer but no less commanding. "We observed you, David. We heard you speak about your dreams of a clinic, a training center, a community hub in that abandoned mall. We saw the way your eyes lit when you spoke of giving people a chance. You may think you are invisible, trapped by circumstance, but you are not. We saw you, and we believe in what we saw." David swallowed hard, the weight of their words pressing against his ribs. He wanted to protest, to say he was just a waiter, that he had no credentials or money or influence. But the sincerity in Eleanor's voice silenced those objections before they could take shape. Still, suspicion flickered at the edges of his thoughts. "Why me?" he asked finally, his tone edged with wariness. "There are thousands of people out there better qualified. Why stage something like this for me?" Whitford's eyes sharpened, a faint smile tugging at the corner of his mouth, though it held no amusement. "Because, Mr. Carter, qualifications can be taught. Skills can be trained, but integrity, compassion, the willingness to give without guarantee of return, that cannot be faked and it cannot be taught. We search for those rare souls who possess it naturally. You are one of them. The sedan turned into a gated drive, gliding past guards who nodded at the tinted windows with deference. Soon they arrived at a sprawling estate, its manicured gardens and towering facades so far removed from David's modest neighborhood that it felt like another planet. As he stepped out, he fought the urge to shrink into himself, reminding himself of his mother's words. Stand tall. Inside, they guided him into a conference room, its long, polished table gleaming under recessed lights. Folders were neatly arranged, and at the head sat Director Martin Harris of the Roosevelt Adult Learning Center, the same man who had encouraged David in his studies, though he had never expected to see him here. Harris gave him a nod of recognition, his eyes warm with pride. Whitford slid one of the folders across the table toward David. On the cover was his name, and inside, as he opened it with hesitant hands, were pages of his life, GED scores, teacher comments, notes from neighbors about how he carried groceries for the elderly or volunteered at local cleanups, even an evaluation from Mr. Harris at the diner. Every piece of his world, carefully documented, neatly compiled. David felt exposed, as though every private corner of his life had been laid bare. Eleanor's voice broke the silence gently. We do not gather these details to intimidate you. We gather them to understand the whole picture. And the picture we see is of a man who could change his community if given the chance. David sat back, his mind spinning. Just days ago, his greatest ambition had been to afford a hot meal for himself after a long shift. Now he was being told that people with wealth and influence believed he could lead something greater. Part of him wanted to believe, to seize the chance that seemed to dangle before him like a rope to a drowning man. Yet another part feared the weight of expectation, the risk of failing not just himself but those who placed trust in him. Whitford seemed to sense the battle raging within him. He leaned forward, his voice firm but not unkind. You do not need to answer today. What we ask is simple. Spend time with us, learn how we work, and decide if this path is truly yours. We will provide the means, education, resources, training, but the choice to walk it must come from you. If you take it for money or prestige, it will crumble. If you take it because your heart demands it, then it will endure. For a long moment, David remained silent, staring at the folder before him. His reflection shimmered faintly on the polished surface of the table, as though even his own image waited for his decision. He thought of his mother, of the empty cupboards, of the abandoned mall he had dreamed of transforming. He thought of the burger and fries he had sacrificed, of the look in the woman's eyes when dignity was restored. Slowly, he lifted his gaze to meet Whitford's steady stare. I don't know if I'm ready, he admitted quietly, his voice carrying the weight of truth. But I do know I can't ignore this. If there's a chance to build something that matters, I have to try. A faint smile touched Eleanor's lips, warm and genuine this time. That is all we ask. And with that, the door to a new life opened wider than David had ever dared to imagine. Yet he also knew deep in his bones that stepping through it would not come without trials. For when the world offers opportunity, it rarely does so without demanding something in return. The choice of a lifetime. David left the Whitford estate that evening with a head spinning so violently, it felt as though the ground beneath him was shifting. The sedan carried him back to his neighborhood, and as he stepped out onto the cracked pavement outside his apartment building, the contrast between worlds nearly broke him. Behind him, the car rolled away into the night, its polished surface reflecting the golden glow of street lamps like a symbol of everything out of reach. Ahead of him, the stairwell light flickered, casting dull shadows against peeling paint and rusted rails. He walked up slowly, clutching the folder still in his hands, every step heavier with the weight of possibility. Inside, his mother was waiting in her chair by the window, the small oxygen machine at her side humming softly. She looked up as he entered, and though her body seemed frail, her eyes carried the strength that had always held him steady. David placed the folder on the table between them, sliding it toward her as if it were something fragile, too sacred to touch without reverence. She opened it carefully, her fingers tracing the pages as though she were feeling the contours of his life laid bare before her. GED scores, teacher comments, neighbors' notes, it was all there, like pieces of a puzzle assembled without their knowledge. They've been watching you, she said softly, her tone neither fearful nor surprised but measured, as though she had expected something like this all along. She lifted her gaze to his. "And now they want you to step into a world that isn't yours yet." David dropped into the chair across from her, burying his face in his hands. "It doesn't make sense, Mom. I'm just a waiter. I don't have the education, the money, the connections. I don't know how to run programs or manage foundations. What if they're wrong about me? What if I fail?" His words tumbled out like stones from a collapsing wall, each one heavier than the last. His mother reached across the table, her thin fingers brushing against his knuckles. "David, listen to me. Every life is made up of choices. Some are small, like whether to take the bus or walk. Others change the direction of everything that comes after. This is one of those choices. But failure? That's not the real danger. The real danger is letting fear decide for you. If you let fear keep you in this place, serving tables until your back breaks, then you'll have failed yourself before you even began." David lifted his head, his eyes burning with unspoken worry. "But what if they only see me as a symbol, not a man? What if they're using me?" Her lips curved into the faintest smile, though sadness lingered in her gaze. "People will always try to use you, David. That doesn't mean you can't use the opportunity to lift others. Remember, kindness is never wasted. You gave away your meal not knowing who was watching. That is why they came to you, because you acted with heart, not calculation. If you carry that same heart into whatever they ask of you, no one can use you without you first deciding what you'll give." Her words sank deep into him, yet the battle within his chest raged on. That night he barely slept. He paced the small apartment, staring out the window at the city lights, each flicker of neon a reminder of lives lived in different orbits from his own. He thought of the diner, of his co-workers who depended on steady shifts, of Mr. Harris who believed rules kept chaos from swallowing the business whole. He thought of his dreams scribbled in that worn notebook, of community centers and clinics that had never existed beyond ink and paper. And he thought of the Whitfords, their piercing eyes, their strange test, their belief in him that felt both like a gift and a burden. The following days blurred into one another. At the diner, customers noticed the distraction in his eyes, the way his hands moved mechanically, his mind elsewhere. Maria teased him lightly, trying to coax him out of his thoughts, but David could not bring himself to explain. How could he? Who would believe that a millionaire couple had staged an entire scene just to see if he would give away a meal? The story sounded more like a parable than a reality, yet the reality refused to release him. Each night he returned to the folder, reading the words of teachers who had believed in him, neighbors who had praised his kindness, strangers who had seen in him something he had never fully seen in himself. It was as if his entire life had been reflected back to him, not through his own eyes clouded by struggle, but through the eyes of others who had watched quietly from the edges. That mirror forced him to confront a truth he had long buried. Perhaps he was capable of more than survival. Perhaps he was meant to lead, but with that realization came fear like he had never known. Leadership meant responsibility. Responsibility meant the possibility of letting others down. And letting others down, that was a weight heavier than hunger, heavier than poverty itself. One evening, as he closed the diner with Mr. Harris, the older man leaned against the counter and studied him with a shrewd eye. "You've been somewhere else lately, Carter. Your hands are here, but your head is miles away. I don't know what's going on, but I'll say this. Don't let the fear of losing what you know keep you from reaching for what you could become. The diner will always be here, but chances like whatever's pulling you won't." His words, though gruff, struck David like a hammer against an already cracking wall. Even Mr. Harris, the man of rules and discipline, saw that he was standing at a crossroads. Back at home, David sat with his mother late into the night. The oxygen machine hummed, the city sounds filtered through thin walls, and between them lay the silence of decision. Finally, he spoke. "If I do this, Mom, it means leaving the diner, leaving the small life we know. It means stepping into something I can't control. I'm terrified." His mother's eyes softened, and she reached out, cupping his face with hands worn by years of sacrifice. "Do you know what terrifies me, David? The thought that you'll bury your light because you're afraid to shine. You are not just a waiter. You are a man who gives when he has little. That is rare. Don't waste it on fear." The next morning, David picked up the phone and dialed the number written on the card the Whitfords had left him. His hand trembled as the line connected, but his voice was steady when he spoke. "Tell Mr. Whitford I'll come." I don't know if I'm ready, but I'm willing to learn. On the other end, the voice responded calmly, as if expecting this all along. Very well, Mr. Carter. The first step begins tomorrow. David set the phone down, his chest rising and falling with the weight of what he had just committed to. He turned to see his mother smiling faintly, tears glistening in her eyes. She whispered, "That's my son." And so the choice was made, not for money, not for prestige, but for the possibility of lifting others with the same compassion that had once led him to sacrifice a meal. Yet deep within, David knew this was only the beginning. The path ahead would test him in ways far greater than anything he had faced, and the cost of failure would not be his alone to bear. The legacy of kindness. The following weeks unfolded like a series of doors opening one after another, each revealing a corridor David had never known existed. He was taken to training centers funded by the Whitford Foundation in cities across the country. In Chicago, he observed how a small neighborhood once plagued by crime had been reborn through after-school programs and vocational workshops. In Atlanta, he walked through a technology hub where young men and women, many of whom had once faced the same barriers he knew so well, now built websites and coded applications with the confidence of people who had discovered their own worth. In Denver, he stood in a community health clinic where doctors and volunteers offered care to those who had long been turned away elsewhere, their smiles proof that compassion could be a form of medicine. Everywhere he went, he studied quietly, asked questions earnestly, and wrote down notes as if gathering not just facts but fragments of hope he would one day weave together back home. At first, David felt like an imposter. Surrounded by people with degrees and polished language, he worried his voice would tremble, his hands would betray his uncertainty. But slowly, he realized that his greatest strength was not in knowing everything but in understanding the lives of those who needed help the most. He knew what it meant to choose between groceries and rent, to walk home in the rain to save bus fare, to go hungry so his mother could eat. That knowledge was not written in textbooks, but it lived in his bones, and people listened when he spoke because they could feel the truth in his words. His humility became his credibility, and his compassion became his authority. Back home, his mother followed his progress through letters and phone calls, her voice always carrying pride even as her health weakened. She reminded him that each step forward was not just his alone, but a path he cleared for others. Her encouragement was his compass, and each time doubt crept in, he recalled her words about dignity and light. When the day finally came to return to his city, he carried with him not just the knowledge he had gained, but the conviction that what seemed impossible could, with enough faith and perseverance, become real. The abandoned mall lot he had once scribbled about in his notebook became the ground where vision turned into reality. With funding and mentorship from the Whitfords, David spearheaded the creation of a community center unlike anything the city had seen. Walls rose where weeds had spread, windows opened where dust had once settled. Inside, classrooms filled with computers offered training for those hungry to learn new skills. A small health clinic provided affordable care. A kitchen served hot meals with no questions asked about payment. And in every hallway, the spirit of dignity thrived. People who had long been overlooked now found a place where their worth was recognized, where their future could be reshaped. Word of the transformation spread, and soon volunteers arrived, teachers offered their time, and businesses donated resources. What began as one man's scribbled dream grew into a movement that breathed new life into the community. David walked those halls daily, not as a figurehead who demanded recognition, but as a servant leader who listened, encouraged, and guided. When people thanked him, he always redirected the gratitude. "This place exists because kindness multiplies," he would say. "One act leads to another, and together we build something stronger than any one person could alone." Years passed, and the story of the young waiter who had once given away his only meal became part of local legend. Children grew up hearing it not as a tale of pity, but as proof that character matters more than circumstance. They learned that wealth was not only measured in money, but in the willingness to give when no one is watching. The Whitfords continued to support the center, but they often remarked that David had given them more than they had given him. The reminder that true leadership is born, not in boardrooms, but in small, unseen sacrifices that reveal the heart. David's mother did not live to see all that he built, but before she passed, she visited the center in her wheelchair, her eyes shining as she watched children learning in the computer lab and families sharing meals in the cafeteria. She squeezed his hand and whispered, "You carried the light, David. You didn't let fear bury it." Those words stayed with him forever, etched into his soul like scripture. Decades later, when David himself had grown older, he often sat in the corner of the community center, watching new generations walk through its doors. He saw young people who had once felt invisible discover their talents. He saw parents who had struggled to provide now find dignity in learning new trades. He saw lives altered not by miracles but by the steady work of compassion multiplied. And each time he thought back to that rainy night in the diner, to the burger and fries he had surrendered, to the look in an old woman's eyes when shame turned to relief. That single act, born of hunger and kindness, had set in motion a chain of events that rippled outward for decades. It proved something timeless, that the smallest choice, when made with selflessness, can echo across lives and generations in ways one could never predict. And so when people asked David how it all began, he never told them about millionaires or foundations or polished conference rooms. He simply said, "It began with an empty plate and the decision to fill someone else's before my own." Because in the end, his story was not about wealth or power or opportunity handed down. It was about kindness given freely, dignity restored, and the truth that no act of compassion is ever too small to change the world.